demonstration for tonight. So my demonstration for tonight is how to make bias tape 2 different ways, and I also wanted to give you a little bit of an explanation of bias tape if you have not had to sew with it before or are not sure what it's about. So I got an email, I think it was last month, I don't remember who sent it, asking an explanation of bias tape. So I pulled out 2 projects with some bias binding, and I just wanted to explain the difference between the 2. So this is the Camp Stitch-A-Lot bag, and on the inside of the Camp Stitch-A-Lot bag there are clear vinyl pockets, and so on the clear vinyl pockets there's binding on the side, and if you'll notice, this binding on the side is straight edge binding. So any binding that is 100% cut or assembled on a straight edge does not need to be cut on the bias. It can just be cut from selvage to selvage, or however you want to do it. However, if you're using binding for a curved edge, like in this Cumberland backpack, so let me turn this lining side out just so that I can show you, but the Cumberland backpack has a few different techniques for finishing. So one of the techniques is sewing right sides together. Another technique is finishing the edges by sewing the lining so that there's raw edges showing on the lining, and then finishing with binding. So here's my Cumberland backpack. I've used this one a ton, and it's got melted chocolate on the bottom over here. Anyway, this is the binding right here, and because it's sewn to a curved edge, it needs to be cut on the bias. So I'm going to jump over to that side camera again. I'm going to show you what bias means. Overhead, sorry Danny. Overhead camera. Okay, so here's a piece of fabric, and as you can see, here's the selvages right here. So there's a certain area of the fabric that stretches. So if I go ahead and pull the fabric parallel to the selvage, it really doesn't stretch, and if I do the same thing pulling from selvage to selvage, it stretches a little bit, but not quite as much as I need it to. However, if I stretch it on the diagonal, it stretches a whole lot. So that's what it means by cutting fabric on the bias. Okay, so I'm going to use that selvage, that white selvage, just so that you can see where the selvage is. And if you have a quilting ruler, that's the easiest way to find a 45-degree angle. If you don't have a quilting ruler, that's your 45-degree angle right there. But I have a ton of quilting rulers, so let me just show you how to find that 45-degree angle. So there's several angles on my ruler. There's 30 right here. Here's 45 right here. And so I'm just going to go ahead and line those 2 lines that intersect that 45 degree with the selvage and the straight edge, the cut edge of the fabric. So right here, that's my 45-degree angle. I like to cut my fabric for binding 2 1/4 of an inch wide, but again, depending on what you're working on, you can modify that for different widths. And I'm just going to go ahead and draw a few lines on the wrong side of my fabric, and these are all pieces that can be sewn together to make one long piece of binding. Okay, so let me get that fabric out of the way and show you the result of my drawings that I just did on the fabric. So I went ahead and cut out along the lines that I just drew, and as you can see, these pieces of fabric stretch quite a bit because they were cut on the bias. Okay, so to attach them to make one long piece of fabric, you're going to sew them right sides together on that diagonal, and when you do that, you're going to line the fabric so that there's a little bit showing on top and bottom. And then this is going to be sewn using a 1/4 of an inch seam allowance. So I've got one that I've already sewn. I had it ready before the show. So this is that same orientation. That's that 1/4 of an inch seam allowance. And I went ahead and pressed the seam open, and then you have one continuous piece of binding, and you can continue adding strips to get a fabric piece as long as you need it. So that's the first method of making bias binding. The second method, and I'm going to have Danny zoom out just a little bit.
Your mat's crooked too.
Thank you, Danny. Okay, that's perfect. Okay, so for the second method, you'll need a square of fabric. So it can be cut in any dimension that you want. I would suggest starting with at least a 10-inch square. I went ahead and cut a 14-inch square, and again, both sides need to be the same measurement. Okay, so flipping to the wrong side of my fabric, and I went ahead and drew with my ruler I drew a line from one corner to the other, and along that line I'm going to use either my rotary cutter or scissors to cut 2 triangles. Okay, so this is the result from that diagonal line. And what I'm going to do with these 2 fabrics is I'm going to sew them right sides together. So I'm going to orient them so that the long diagonal is in the center. And just like that binding piece that I showed you earlier, you're going to have a little bit of overhang of fabric on either end. And then this bottom edge right here is going to be sewn using 1/4 inch seam allowance. So let me show you what that looks like after it's been sewn. So here's my 2 pieces sewn. I went ahead and pressed the seam open, and this is what it looks like actually. Once you've pressed that seam open, this is what it looks like from the wrong side of the fabric. Okay, so I went ahead and prepared my lines before the show. So because I'm looking for binding that is 2 1/4 inch wide, I went ahead with my ruler and I drew lines starting from this edge right here, every 2 1/4 inch. And I had a little bit of extra when I got to the end, and I went ahead and just left that right there. Okay, so the next piece of the puzzle is to bring your fabrics so that they're right sides together. Okay, so what you do not want to do is you do not want to have your fabrics right sides together so that it looks like a square and the edges are nice and perfect on the sides. That's what you do not want to do. What you do want to do, however, is start your line 1 in so that they're kind of offset a bit. We're going to be sewing this edge right here right sides together. However, you need to make sure that your line is continuous. So by just holding your lines so that they meet, they're not going to be continuous. I went ahead and took my Wonder Clip and I sort of eyeballed it after I placed my Wonder Clip and made sure that the line was continuous. And as you can see, it is. And you just want to double check by pinning to make sure all of the lines are going to be continuous after you sew them. So I have this piece right here. I went ahead and sewed and pressed the seam open. Again, that's going to be 1/4 inch seam allowance. And then I'm going to take my scissors and I'm going to start to cut, and you're just cutting directly on top of the lines, 1 layer of fabric at a time. So as you can see, I'm kind of going all the way around, and this is going to leave me with 1 long continuous piece of binding. So either method will work, whichever one you're more comfortable with doing. I most commonly use that first method just because I usually have a bigger piece of fabric to work with, and I like to cut and have as few seams showing as possible. So if I can, I'll just go ahead and cut on a 45-degree angle right through the center of, say, a yard of fabric, and that'll leave me with a fairly long, maybe 30-inch piece of binding, which is generally enough for most of the bags that I'm working on. But this is helpful as well, especially if you need a really long piece for the inside of the bag, like that Cumberland backpack that I showed you. And again, like I mentioned at the beginning, you can use different widths for cutting. You can use 1 inch, 2 inches, whatever you need for the project that you're working on. Okay, so I'm almost at the end. I'll have this little bit of scrap left over because this is certainly not 2 1/4 inches wide. But when I finish, I don't even have to press anything because I pressed as I went along. And I've got a really long piece of continuous bias binding. Okay, so I hope you enjoyed that demonstration. I hope that answered the question on what exactly bias binding is and how to make it, and now you can make your own bias binding at home rather than purchasing some from the store. And it's really nice making your own because then you can match your lining fabric or whatever fabric you're using for your project.